Good morning. Let's get seated and let's get going. Glad to see everybody here. There is a handout in the very back if you got one. Zoomers, as soon as class is over with, I am going to take that handout and email it to all of you that registered for the class that are on Zoom. If you're in the room and you have a cell phone, if you could please silence it, would be greatly appreciated so it doesn't go off during the talk. And Roy Hunt is here today to introduce our speaker.
Testing, can you hear me in the back? Well, this is a great pleasure for me to introduce Jerry Kirkpatrick. I became involved in ILR primarily because of Jerry. Long before I moved to Okamos, which was about 10 years ago, I was coming here to hear Jerry's lectures. If you're very new, you probably haven't heard Jerry lecture, but in my opinion, he's the best lecturer we've ever had. He combines a talent for research, synthesis of the research, and then delivery of the material better than anyone else I know. And we happen to admire the same person at Yale, who was my mentor, Myers McDougall. And we're certainly fortunate to have Jerry and his wife, Gay, living here. Probably no one else here did the due diligence to determine where they wanted to spend the latter part of their lives. Gay had a spreadsheet, and over a couple of years, they traveled around the United States looking at potential retirement sites. Fortunately, we won, and I just asked Jerry if they had made the right decision, and he says yes. So again, I begged Jerry to come out of retirement for one lecture to talk about a subject I thought was, at the time, very important. Well, it's become more important with each passing day. And again, I appreciate so much his willingness to do this. I'm going to read, if I can, because of my pitiful eyesight, a brief bio of Jerry, and then I'll turn it over to him. But Jerry is a retired U.S. Navy captain and retired attorney at law. He holds the A.B. degree, magna cum laude, from Temple University, the J.D. degree from the College of William and Mary, and the LLM degree with highest honors from the George Washington University. Jerry has held adjunct faculty positions at Christopher Newport College, now University, and the National Law Center at the George Washington University. Additionally, Jerry served as Director of Academics at the Naval Justice School in Newport, Rhode Island, and he taught graduate-level international law classes and seminars at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Jerry is a past president of the Pentagon chapter of the Federal Bar Association. He served in the Pentagon as special counsel and military assistant to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. So Jerry, come tell us about China.
All right. Well, the first thing I have to say is that introduction, I didn't know whether to try to slink out the door or just make a break for it. Because high praise indeed, Roy, especially coming from you and the level of respect I've always had for you. And so when Roy asked me if I would give a presentation on Law of the Sea, I right at the top of my head, I said yes. And he said, there's a particular interest in the Law of the Sea, and if you could mention that the United States is not a party to the Law of the Sea Convention, and perhaps talk about some of the ramifications of that, that might be helpful, and I'll be happy to do that. When I said yes, though, I didn't know what I was biting off. So it turned out to be quite a bit, and I hope it's not more than I can chew. But because the law of the sea is very technical, and I didn't want to get too far down in the weeds. I figured, how am I going to present this stuff? I didn't want to get too far down in the weeds because I figured within 5 or 10 minutes, I'd look around and everybody's eyes would be glassed over, and that would be understandable. So I figured how to make this relevant, and I asked myself, well, where in the world right now are these law of the sea provisions relevant? And the answer that popped right in my mind was the South China Sea, because as this first little introduction slide shows, it is indeed a sea of contention. This is in the era that we're in now with great power competition, and right now with the situation, it's becoming more tense and more intense. The competition between the United States and China, it's spilling over into some very concerning areas. And so it is becoming more and more relevant. I want to say a couple things just at the outset. I want to be in a race against time, I think, pretty much, because with this, and I hate to really rush through some of this stuff. I know some of you have signed up for a tour of the Public Safety Training Center, and I believe the bus leaves at 11:15. So if you have to leave for that, that's certainly understandable. It is Zoomed, it's going to be recorded, the slides will be recorded, the handout will be available, and you could do that. But I'm willing to stay as long as anybody wants me to. And one thing I'm not going to be able to get into in the general presentation is the issue of Taiwan, which is extremely important. And I think regardless of how you might feel about Taiwan, I think it's important that you know all the sides of the argument. And we hear an awful lot about the support for Taiwan as the democracy and all that. But I think it's important to understand where China's coming from and what the basis for China's claim that Taiwan is. So I have a little material on that as well, and we can talk about that later if anybody wants to stay around for it. But if I could have the next slide there, Ralph. Thank you. Ralph Smith is here with me today. He's my dear friend for over 30 years from the Washington, D.C. area. He and his wife reside in Gainesville now, and they're on the waiting list to come in Okamic, so I hope we'll be neighbors here before too long. So Ralph is going to assist me with the slides. Asia's Cauldron. This is a book that Robert Kaplan wrote back in 2014, and he was referring to the South China Sea as a percolating pot. And he said if this pot boiled over, it could lead to armed confrontation between the United States and China. Because back then, there were tensions building in the South China Sea, not only between the United States and China, but principally with the United States and China, but also there was a flurry of other maritime claims on the part of the other coastal states. And we'll talk about that when we get into more into the presentation. But Kaplan was concerned, and he said, boy, this is really becoming the sea of contention. And he was looking at what was in the news at the time. The problem is, and it goes right to the heart of the U.S.-China competition that's going on right now. The United States has been, since the end of World War II, and remains the prominent naval power in the South China Sea. And China is the aspiring prominent naval power. They consider the South China Sea as kind of their home waters. And they have a vast territorial claim that we will see in just a minute or two, or a few minutes. And so that's where the rub comes in right now. And that's really going to be the kind of the heart of the presentation. Can I have the next slide, Val? Okay. The next book I want to talk to you about just for a minute is Graham Allison's. Graham Allison is a Harvard professor at the Kennedy School, and he wrote this book 3 years after Kaplan's book in 2017, during the first year of the first Trump administration, when the trade war started and things between the United States and China were heating up even more. And he was concerned about where this might go in terms of a potential armed conflict between the United States and China. And so he titled his book Destined for War: Can America and China Escape the Thucydides Trap? I had to say Thucydides about 4 or 5 times. It was such a tongue twister to make sure I got it right. But he was concerned, and he said in his analysis that unless the United States and China took difficult and painful decisions with regard to a change in course of conduct, that China and the United States were destined for war. And he brought up this idea of the Thucydides trap and asked the question, can the United States and China escape the Thucydides trap? And what he's referring to is Thucydides analyzed the Peloponnesian War. And he said the Peloponnesian War started because Athens, which was the prominent power at the time, felt threatened by the rise of Sparta and reached a decision that we need to go to war with Sparta to kind of nip this thing in the bud, because Sparta's getting too big for its britches. So it started a war with Sparta to try to thwart Sparta's rise. Athens lost. And the Thucydides analyzed the whole conflict at the end, in which he was a participant, by the way. And so he came up with this idea that Athens felt trapped by the rise of Sparta. So Graham Allison's asking the question, does the United States feel trapped by the rise of China? And are we likely to have the same thing happen in our age as what happened back at the time of the Peloponnesian War? Will the United States at some point feel so threatened that they're going to say, we got to fight them now because they're getting too strong. Now we have a decent chance of winning, but at the rate they're growing, they're going to overtake us, both economically and militarily. So that's what Kaplan's thesis is about. And he looked at history, and he offered a ray of hope in his book as well, because he analyzed history, because this has happened numerous times, where there's been a prominent power and then a rising power. The U.S. and Britain's a good example. At some point, we overtook Britain. After Britain figured out that the independence of the colonies was probably going to stick, it didn't later rise into a Thucydides trap. And he gave examples where it did result in war, when there was a rising power threatening a dominant power. And he gave examples where it did not. So basically, he says, we have a choice here. We have a choice. War is not inevitable, but unless we and China together make some pretty important and serious changes, we're likely to eventually wind up in a state of armed conflict against each other. And that would be a disaster for the entire world. And if this is going to take place right now, the most likely place in the world is the South China Sea, because that's where our forces are coming into contact on a daily basis. That's where this tension is the most prominent and the most visible on a daily basis. So it's the South China Sea that is most likely to be the place where initial conflict between, it might just be minor skirmishing in the beginning, but even a minor skirmish is problematic because of what it could escalate to. So that was, that was Graham Allison's concern. In the complicate matters, there are other maritime claims in the South China Sea that are overlapping. For example, Vietnam, and you can go right down, right down the line of the coastal states in the South China Sea, and they have their own maritime claims which are in conflict with each other because they overlap. The China Sea is contains a vast amount of water, but it's really, we'll be talking about a concept called the exclusive economic zone, which goes out to 200 miles from the coast. When you start putting those together, what looks like a vast amount of water turns out to be not so vast after all, and lends itself to conflicting claims. And that's what's going on. Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, and even Taiwan, whose claims are derivative from China, have overlapping maritime claims. And any one of them getting into a contest, even a skirmish, could draw in the major powers. So that's really the concern that we will be looking at. Recently, China and the Philippines got into a tussle. And we'll take a look at that because that's still kind of going on. That's simmering. That's part of this, percolating pot that Kaplan was talking about, and that pot is percolating. What's going on between China and the Philippines certainly could erupt. The pot could boil over, and we could find ourselves involved. But before looking at the South China Sea, I'm going to be making reference to some concepts, and I think it's important that we at least are introduced to these concepts. For example, if I talk about the exclusive economic zone, which is very, very important in the South China Sea, I want at least everybody to have an idea of what that is and the importance of it, so that you'll have, you'll have an understanding as to what these conflicting, what's causing the conflict in the South China Sea. And if I could have the next slide now. Okay, you got it? Here we go. Okay, this is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. I was privileged because I got to work on this thing for almost 10 years. The convention was under a state of negotiation for over 10 years, and it was put together. This book was put together from a series of working papers. How this convention came together, it came together from these working papers, which were put together in sessions of working groups. There were working groups on every issue that wound up in the convention was assigned to a working group. And then within the working groups, there were subgroups. And I happen to have been assigned to two working groups, a working group on the territorial sea and the working group on international straits. And it was great. It was absolutely great because for a period of a number of years, I went to these meetings of the working group, and they were held in the various capitals around the world. And I don't want to use the term boondoggle, but these were great trips because first of all, it was fun. I was introduced to places I would have never gotten to. And it was such a privilege to work with the people from these other countries who were members of these working groups. And the working group, I don't know what the picture you might have in your mind of a working group, but they were more like conferences. The real work was done back in the individual countries. We would write papers. And they would go through the vetting process and all that. And then we would take those papers to a meeting of the working group. And the papers were presented by somebody like, for example, from the United States at the Deputy Assistant Secretary level. Would be one of the Deputy Assistant Secretaries of State or Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense of the United States presenting the paper. And then the paper would be distributed and we would talk about the issues that were raised in the last session. And then the sub-principals at the Deputy Assistant Secretary level then would discuss and come to some kind of consensus agreement, and then we go into the next issue. But the real work was done back in our individual office, writing these working papers and then taking them up the line and redrafting and getting comments from here, getting comments from there. It's quite tedious, that part of it is. And then, but the working sessions was a little bit of a misnomer. There wasn't real work. There wasn't scut work. There wasn't drudgery work at the working sessions. There were meetings more. And there would be issues discussed and debates at that political level. And that's really how this thing was put together. But it was in 10 years in the makings, and it was quite an undertaking, and it was quite an achievement to get it done. The navigation provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention now represent customary international law. In other words, there are enough nations of the world that accept these principles that they bind non-parties. And I mentioned the United States is not a party to the Law of the Sea Convention. I'll talk about that a little later. Basically, they felt that they were giving up too much sovereignty because of the seabed mining provisions. But if we have time, we'll get into that a little later. But as of now, 166 parties to this convention out of the 195 recognized nations of the world. So the convention has wide acceptance. And again, all the non-seabed mining provisions are now recognized as being part of customary international law, which means they bind all parties. So now, with that understanding, let's get into the convention itself, and I want to go over the maritime zones that are in the convention, because the maritime zones determine what rights a coastal state has in the sea going outward from the coastal state. We'll talk about, so it's important to understand the 4 maritime zones. There are 2 that are more important than others for us, and there's one that's particularly important. So I'll probably gloss over 2 of them because they really won't be that important to what we're talking about, but I want to make you aware of them anyway. So if I could have the next slide, if you will. Can we get the next slide? Okay, I want to introduce you to the concept of the baseline. The baseline is very important because I want to make sure yes it is, I want to make sure my pointer's working. The baseline is extremely important because the baseline is the point from which all maritime zones are measured. They're all measured from a country's baseline. And for purposes of the law of the sea, the baseline is where the sea begins. You will see that it's not always where the water touches the land. There are some cases where the baseline is drawn differently, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But it is the point from which all maritime zones are measured. So that's the importance of the baseline. So I'm going to ask you if you just keep that concept in mind, because I'll be talking rather extensively about baselines. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, good. These are the maritime zones, and you can see that they start at the baseline. Everything inside the baseline belongs to the country, absolutely, absolutely. The landmass of a country and all its internal waters. Internal waters are lakes, rivers, coves, inlets, and bays. They belong to the coastal state. Absolutely. No foreign country has any rights inside the country's baseline. Moving out 12 nautical miles. I want to mention this is a good point for me to mention this. Two things to keep in mind. Okay. When we talk about miles, whenever I mention miles, I'm talking about a nautical mile. A nautical mile is just slightly larger than a land mile or statutory mile. So if you can just think of it in that sense, slightly larger, 5,280 feet is a land mile or statutory mile. A nautical mile is about 6,075 feet. So it's not that much bigger. And the other thing, when I talk about a state or a coastal state, I'm talking about a nation. In the Law of the Sea Convention, nations are called states, and the coastal state is the state from which the maritime zones are mentioned. So moving out in 12 nautical miles is the territorial sea. The United States had a 3-mile territorial sea from the founding of the Republic until 1988. We had a 3-mile territorial sea. President Reagan signed a proclamation in 1988 extending the territorial sea to 12 nautical miles. And that's in keeping with the convention, which opened for signature in 1982, and the U.S. signed it in 1994. President Clinton signed it for the United States, sent it over to the Senate, where it has languished ever since. So that's why we're not a party to it. But okay, the 12 nautical mile territorial sea, that belongs to the country as well. That belongs to the coastal state. Coastal state has as much right over, over this area going out 12 miles from the baseline as it does over anything else that it owns, with one exception. There is what's known as innocent passage for vessels, not for aircraft. National airspace starts right here. This is the national airspace out to 12 nautical miles. The U.S., for example, owns all its airspace out to 12 nautical miles at sea. But in the territorial sea itself, in the water, there is a right that foreign vessels have, the right of innocent passage. And innocent passage, if you'll just think it's passing through, the convention uses the terms continuous and expeditious. It must be a continuous passage. Think of it this way. If you own a house and your house has a backyard, you own that house, but the public has an easement where members of the public can walk through that far end of your backyard. But that's all that easement allows them to do. They can walk from one end of your backyard to the other going through. They don't need your permission to do it. Okay, that's the territorial sea, the innocent passage in the territorial sea. It's me, I'm just passing through. Okay, and that's it. The foreign ship must fly its flag in innocent passage, and a warship, by custom and tradition, but not in the convention, will identify itself in coming into another nation's territorial sea. All right, moving out from the territorial sea, and not on here, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, is the contiguous zone. Again, measured from the baseline. Here's that baseline again. 12 nautical mile territorial sea. National airspace comes out to here. Out to 24 nautical miles is the contiguous zone. And that gives the coastal states some limited rights. It gives it a right to enforce its laws in 4 categories: customs, fiscal, which means taxation, immigration, and sanitation. So in the contiguous zone, the coastal state has those limited rights. Okay. The one that's really of interest, will be of interest to us, is the exclusive economic zone. The exclusive economic zone was not part of customary international law prior to the convention. It's a creature of the convention, and it gives the coastal state exclusive rights out to 200 nautical miles from the baseline. And in that area, the coastal state has absolute right to fisheries and anything on the seabed floor. If they want to drill for oil and gas, they can do it. If they want to mine the seabed floor for minerals, they can do it. But that's all it is. It's a right to the natural resources. It is not ownership. Ownership stops at the 12 miles. Coastal state does not own this area out to 200 miles, okay, but they have exclusive rights. And when you look at the maritime contests around the world, most of them today involve fisheries, you know, particularly with the Japanese fishing fleet and the Russian fishing fleet. They seem to always be getting into somebody else's exclusive economic zone, and they'll have to get kicked out. And that's a big contention in the maritime space these days. And I'll just mention briefly, when there's an extended continental shelf, and there aren't that many extended continental shelves, and that's a term of art in the convention. An extended continental shelf means it extends out past 200 miles. So when the continental shelf extends out past 200 miles, the coastal state has the right to the natural resources of the continental shelf, but not the water above. Anybody confused yet? Okay, not the water above. Okay, they got the water out to 200 miles. But where the continental shelf extends out past that, coastal state has the right to the continental shelf out to a distance of 350 miles from the baseline. Okay, now that everybody is an expert on baselines and the maritime zones. The maritime zone that I really want you to think about is the exclusive economic zone. I took a look. I don't know of any issues right now, any burning issues right now concerning territorial sea claims. Okay, I don't know of any, zero, concerning contiguous zones, but there are plenty, including the ones in the South China Sea, about the exclusive economic zone. Okay. All right, now that you know all about the baseline and these maritime zones, let's go to the next slide, and we'll see how these baselines are drawn. Is that the next one? Did you skip? Okay, go there. Okay, that's the first one. Okay, this is a great slide, and I can use this to illustrate how they're drawn. There are two types of baselines. There are normal baselines and straight baselines. Most baselines in the world are normal baselines. Think of the coast. Think of this area here. Think of the coast. The normal baseline follows what the convention calls the contours of the coast. That's the normal baseline, and it's measured from the low water mark, which means that's where the water meets the land at low tide. That's called the low water mark. So the normal baseline is drawn like this, okay, along the coast at the low water mark. Again, that's low tide. Think of low tide where the water washes up onto the sand of the beach, okay, low tide. That's your normal baseline. But the convention allows for straight baselines to be drawn under a few circumstances. The first one is, I'll use this slide right here, where there are fringing islands, as the convention calls them, fringing islands. Much of the coast of the United States is fringed with islands, including Florida. Florida has many offshore islands. It can be, 50 feet offshore, it could be 2 or 3 miles offshore. But much of the coast of the United States and elsewhere in the world, the coastline is fringed with islands. And in that case, the conventional law allows for the state to draw straight baselines, which means they can connect the outermost points of the outermost islands. So you see, that's what this state here did. It drew its baseline here. Notice it ignored these islands. Ignored, 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 ignored. And why is that? Because they're not the outermost islands. So it allows the state, and anything in the base, within the baseline again, belongs exclusively to the state. This water in here belongs to the state as much as any river in the state does. Okay? The country owns it totally. The other area, the other situation where the straight baselines are allowed to be drawn, and that's where the convention calls a deeply indented coastline. Think of coves and inlets, where there are a lot of coves and inlets. This would make for a very difficult territorial sea for mariners if the baseline went all like that. Because don't forget, it's projected out to 12 miles. And mariners have to know, are we in territorial sea or out? It's just much for convenience of mariners, and also because these waters are integrated so deeply with the land. In other words, they have the character of internal waters. Again, think inlets and coves. Okay, that's where pleasure boaters come in, and fishing boats and so on. So it's convenience for mariners, it's convenience for the coastal state. And again, 10 years of negotiations, and this is a good point. This is a good time for me to mention this point. Like everything else in international law, where there is no sovereign, there's no sovereign to tell nations, hey guys, this is what the law is. It's what they come together and decide it is. So all these things were negotiated. During these meetings I was telling you about, the members of one state would say, well, what about coves and inlets? You know, are we going to have it? We have to draw baselines? And someone said, oh, that's a stupid idea. No, we don't want to do that. Well, we want to let states draw straight baselines. And then somebody would say, yeah, I think so too. And then winds up in the convention. So that everything is negotiated, and you're going to see some distance limits. I'm going to talk about some distance limits, and you're going to probably wonder, where do these numbers come from? Well, they were negotiated. That's where they came from. There's no magic about the numbers. Okay, next slide, please. Can we get the next slide? No, back one. Okay, thank you. Okay, this is the bay. Remember I said bays are internal waters? I'm speaking practically because they are. Again, I was on the working group for the territorial sea, which is projected outward from the baseline. And so bays were a heavy topic of discussion. Everybody want to talk about bays. And at the end, when all was said and done, no country was denied being able to close off a bay. They wanted to close off a bay. We found a way to close off the bay. Okay, so the bays would be internal waters. Okay, but there are rules for this, and the rules wound up in the convention. You don't have to think about this much because, again, practically speaking, everybody wanted a bay got a bay. But the rule for a baseline is that in closing off a bay, that baseline cannot exceed 24 miles. Why 24? Why not 25? Why not 20? Again, negotiation, okay? Somebody said, well, what do you need to close off that bay? What is the distance from headland to headline in your bay? Well, 22 miles. Well, mine's 24. Like, it's almost like an auction. I hear 24 once, 24 twice. Anybody else? Anybody have a larger bay, bay they want to close? No, so 24 became the number, okay? That's literally how these things are done. And the semicircle test, a semicircle has to fit into the water that's being closed off. Where did this come from? Somebody suggested it, and it wound up in the convention. Okay, next slide. This slide simply says that in calculating the 24 miles, when there are islands out in the mouth of the bay, you can subtract the distance of the island, subtract the length of the islands to come up with your 24. Here we're told it's 23. So here's 12, 7, which makes 19. To get the 23, this would have to be 4 over here going to the headland. But this slide simply shows that when there are islands out there, you subtract the length of the island and coming up with your 24. Okay. One last thing regarding bays. There were some bays that were so large, and nobody was in favor of a closing line as large as these particular bays. And arguments were made about the historic nature of the water, that the concept of historic bays was considered, and it wound up in the convention. The United States said, we consider 2 of our bays to be historic. From the beginning of the Republic until the present time, we have always considered the Chesapeake Bay and Delaware Bay as our internal waters. We've always treated those waters as such. We've done it over the period of the history of our country. And the Soviet, this was done now during, remember what I said now, the convention opened for signature in 1982. So, we signed it in 94, but it was negotiated during the late 70s and through the 80s, during the Cold War. The Soviet Union piped up and said, we always considered Peter the Great Bay as our historic waters. So, and then somebody else from a country that didn't have anywhere near the clout that the United States or Soviet Union did during those days, came up and said, well, what about our bay? We said, no, forget that. So the historic bays that are recognized are Chesapeake, Delaware, Peter the Great Bay, are the major recognized bay. And so, well, how are we going to handle that? And here's the way they handled it, very interestingly. Article 10 of the convention, which kind of is a capstone of all these little things I've been talking about, says, the foregoing provisions do not apply to so-called historic bays, period. The foregoing provisions, which have all these little rules I've been talking about, don't apply to so-called historic bays, and that's where I left it. And that's where it stands today. But our claim to our bays, now Russia's claim to Peter the Great, have never been contested. Vietnam, after the Vietnam War, did apply to have the Gulf of Tonkin closed off as a bay, but the United States objected vehemently, as did the Soviet Union, by the way, and so that was not accepted. All right, we're ready to move on to the next feature. I'm trying to get to the South China Sea, but we need to talk about maritime features because these maritime features figure so prominently in the South China Sea. The maritime features that are recognized in the Law of the Sea Convention are 3: islands, rocks, and low tide elevations. Every other maritime feature falls under low tide elevations. Think sandbars, okay, reefs, for example. Reefs, sandbars, shoals, they all fit under the category of low tide elevations. So let me give you a definition of these things before we move on, so you understand, because they are defined in the convention, and so for purposes of the convention, they have to meet these definitions. An island is a natural feature of land surrounded by water that is above water both at high tide and low tide and can sustain human habitation or economic activity. That's an island. And we're all familiar with islands. Some of us may even lived on islands, but we've all certainly visited islands. And so whatever picture you have in your mind of an island, it's a good one. There are people there, activity there, and you understand it's always above water, high tide, low tide, and it's a naturally formed area of land. A rock is very close to an island, very similar to an island. It's a naturally formed area of land surrounded by water, above water, both at high tide and low tide. The difference is it cannot, in its natural state, sustain human habitation or economic activity. That's a rock. An island generates these maritime zones I was talking about. Any island generates the same maritime zone. Every island has a territorial sea, a contiguous zone, exclusive economic zone, and a continental shelf if it has one. That's why when you get into the South China Sea and we start talking about these hundreds and hundreds of islands out there, why it's so important to understand this concept and what they do. A rock also generates, believe it or not, generates maritime zones, but just the first two, territorial sea and a contiguous zone, but not an exclusive economic zone, or even if it has a continental shelf, that has no juridical status. So, okay, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. This is a good one. Okay, let's just review for a minute. Okay, if we were doing, here's the normal baseline, follows the contour of the coast. Here's the territorial sea out here, 12 miles. And all I want to point out here is that when an island is in the territorial sea, such as this one, okay, it can be used as a baseline for determining the territorial sea. So here, the baseline is not here. The baseline is all here, but the baseline is not here. The baseline's out here. The baseline's out here, which results in a bulge in the territorial sea. Okay, a low tide elevation is simply that. It's a naturally formed area of land surrounded by water that is above water at low tide, but underwater at high tide. That's a low tide elevation. Low tide elevations can be important because if a low tide elevation exists in the territorial sea, it can be used to draw a baseline. So here's your baseline, except when you get here, they really should have used dotted lines here and here. When you get here, because this low tide elevation, we're told this is low tide, these three are low tide elevations. When we get here, you see that the baseline gets bulged out, okay? Here's a low tide elevation outside the territorial sea. Now, they did use dotted lines here. That generates no maritime zones whatsoever, okay? But here again, we can see by the markings, these islands here belong to this coastal state. So here, this island generates its own territorial sea, contiguous zone, and so on. It has a low tide elevation within its territorial sea, which is this boundary here. So again, you get a bulge, okay? See, this is why I don't want to do this. Everybody confused? All right, don't worry about it, because we're going to talk about exclusive economic zones when we get to the South China Sea. Okay, can we have the next slide? Okay, here's just a picture of a rock. Okay, there's a rock out in the sea. And again, it generates its own territorial sea and contiguous zone. Okay, next slide. Another rock. Okay. All right, now we're going to get into an interesting concept in the law of the sea that came about with the convention, did not exist before the convention. Next slide. Archipelagos. Okay, when I first encountered the word archipelagos, I thought they were talking about a big bird, but no, they were talking about islands. That was pelican, I guess, the big bird. But anyway, an archipelago is simply a group of islands. That's all it is. But it's very important in law of the sea because of the concept of the archipelagic state. New creature under the convention, did not exist before. Next slide. Okay, and this is the archipelagic state. I'll tell you why it's so important. Here's a country that exists solely with islands. In other words, there's no mainland component to it at all. It exists solely as a group of islands. Okay, and the ones that are important for us, and I'll mention briefly, the Bahamas, close to home, Philippines, and Indonesia are the two archipelagic states that will be important to us when we get into the South China Sea. So I want to mention this concept of the archipelagic state because, again, it did not exist. Prior to the convention, let's assume this is Indonesia, okay, which consists of a vast number of islands. But this is a simplified illustration. Okay. Let's assume that this is Indonesia, okay? And all these islands belong to Indonesia. Before the Law of the Sea Convention, each one of these islands would have generated those maritime zones I talked about. But with the convention, they really got a boom. And I will tell you that one of the most influential parties to negotiating the Law of the Sea Convention was Indonesia, which is the largest archipelago in the world. It consists of hundreds of islands stretched over vast territory, known formally as the Dutch East Indies. Okay? With the convention, and again, those of you who think this is a great idea because you love island states, you can thank Indonesia. Okay? With the convention, these states are now permitted to draw baselines connecting the outermost portion of their islands. All this becomes like internal waters, which they own completely. No foreign nation has a right except to internationally recognized sea lanes and air travel lanes. No other state has a right inside these waters at all. Territorial sea is measured from the outside with the contiguous zone, the exclusive economic zone, continental shelf. That all starts out here. So this gave Indonesia, for example, vast control of thousands of miles of water. Didn't exist before. Okay. Now, forget what I'm about to say, okay? Because there's a test, just like everything else, you know, in the convention. This is international law. This is a test. There's a two-part test, actually a three-part test for an archipelagic state to come into existence. One, the country has to exist solely of islands. For example, Hawaii is an archipelago. The Hawaiian Islands make up an archipelago, but the United States is not an archipelagic state because of the mainland. Neither is Malaysia, because most of Malaysia is on the Malay Peninsula. Doesn't qualify, okay? Not every island nation qualifies because there's a two-part test. First of all, the ratio between land and water cannot exceed 1:9. Now, where do you think that 1:9 came up from? It came because that's what it would take to make Indonesia qualify. That's where it came from. And the Philippines said, oh yeah, we can meet that too. So, okay. The other thing is, okay, this gives you an idea of how intricate, you know, these negotiations can be. The second rule of this is none of these baselines can exceed 100 miles, except 3% can. 3% of the baselines can exceed 100 miles, up to 125 miles. Now, where do you think that came from? It came from calculations so that Indonesia would qualify. That's where it came from. Okay, now you know maritime zones, and you know a little bit about these navigation rights. and archipelagic states. So let's see what else we got. Next slide. Okay, a few examples. Okay, this is the Seychelles. Seychelles qualify. Okay, Seychelles qualifies. This is not there's a scale. You can see that if you looked at these numbers and tallied them up, you'd see that they would qualify. They meet the 1:9 ratio and they meet the 100-mile. Okay, next. Next. Thank you. Okay, this is the Bahamas, one close to home. And this is the point where I want to mention something else. Remember earlier I talked about restricted waters where when you start putting these 200-mile exclusive economic zones together, you run out of water, right? Here, for example, there's not enough water between necessarily. Okay, this all within these baselines are islands belonging to the Bahamas, Commonwealth of the Bahamas. All archipelagic waters here, and with the maritime zones coming out to here. You can look at this and it becomes very, very obvious. There's not a lot of water here. There's not a lot for Cuba, for example, to have its 200-mile exclusive economic zone, and the Bahamas to have it. And that happens all over the world. That's where the equidistant principle comes in. And that's in the convention as well. But that was always a concept of customary international law, because in straits, for example, in straits, it was not even always possible in straits to have a 12-mile territorial sea for each country. I give an example right here off the coast of the west coast of the United States. Off the coast of Washington State, between us and Canada, is the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And at points, there's not enough water for a territorial sea of 12 nautical miles between us and Canada. So that's a good example where the equidistant principle would apply. So whenever there's not enough water, the convention provides for the equidistant principle, but it also says that the states involved can, between themselves, they can negotiate something else. If they want another arrangement, the one thing they cannot do is they cannot close off international navigation. So there's what's known in the convention as transit passage, which means that the entire community of nations has the right to international navigation, both on the water, under the water for submarines, and in the air over the straits. They cannot close off what's known as transit passage, the right of every nation's vessels and aircraft to transit through international straits. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is a great slide. This is a super slide because this is what's going to take us into the South China Sea. You'll notice this is Australia, right? This is Australia. This shaded area is the exclusive economic zone of Australia. And now you'll notice that there are other similarly shaded areas here. There's one here, there's one here, there's a partial one here. That's because these exclusive economic zones also belong to Australia. Now, if you looked at another map, you could see that there are Norfolk Islands over here, there's the Cocos Islands over here. They belong to Australia as well. And if this chart were of a different scale, you would see in the middle, you'd see an island. You'd see an island here, you'd see an island there, and you'd see an island over here somewhere, and down here as well. Because, again, they're generating these zones that we've talked about. So, but the thing to watch, though, is the exclusive economic zone around the continent of Australia, country of Australia. Back in February, a Chinese naval group consisting of 3 warships and a replenishment ship came out of the South China Sea up here, transited through the Philippines, which is up here, transited through the Philippines archipelago, down into the Indonesian archipelago down through here. This is Papua New Guinea, through the Torres Strait, which again, Australia and Papua New Guinea, even though their territorial sea and zones might overlap here, they do not have the right to choke off international transit in the strait. So they came through the Torres Strait down here into the Coral Sea. Now, you can see that they're in Australia's exclusive economic zone, which they have a right to be. Australia doesn't own that. Australia only owns 12 miles. Doesn't own this. They have the exclusive rights to the natural resources. So they were coming down. So this transit, this group of naval vessels transited down here into the Coral Sea. And you will see down here that they go in and out of the exclusive economic zone of Australia. Now down here, they conducted live fire drills. It's the first time that China sent warships down off the coast of Australia and did any kind of live fire exercises. It was a first. And it really got Australia's attention, Australia and New Zealand. It was designed for a purpose, to get their attention, to demonstrate their capabilities. And it got their attention, and it got ours too. So they did that down here. They went outside. They were in the exclusive economic zone here. They came out. They did their live fire exercises. Then they went back into the exclusive economic zone, and then out of it, and then into it, and out of it. And then and across here, they said, oh, well, we're here. We may as well go into the Australia's economic zone here as well. And they went back up into the Indonesian archipelago. And that was in February and March. So demonstrating what they had the capacity to do. Next slide, please. Okay, and these are the ships. And I want to give a shout out to Dick Martin. Here he is in the back. Dick did these slides for me. I'm always grateful to Dick. I couldn't do any of these presentations without Dick. Dick found the ships, did the slides, and here they are. Zuni is a destroyer. Heng Yang is a frigate. Rishanu is the replenishment ship that went along with the Naval Surface Action Force. Next slide. Can I have the next slide? There we go. Dick found the names of the ships and he superimposed them on the ships. That's the frigate Heng Yang. This gives you an idea what the state of warship construction. It's universal. I mean, all the major navies. You have to see what flag they're flying because the designs are basically pretty much the same. This is a frigate, a Chinese frigate. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Okay, there's the destroyer, Heng Shui. Okay, Chinese. Next one. There's the Zuni. The next, that's a Chinese destroyer. Okay. Okay, great. We're gonna be with this slide for a while because it shows China's maritime claim. It shows the entire South China Sea, and it is so strategic to China. Here's China along here, but the Chinese coast also goes all the way up here. Okay, here's Taiwan. It all goes up all the way up here, and it's China's means of ingress and egress in a maritime sense. And at the bottom of it lies the Strait of Malacca. Strait of Malacca. This now is the most strategic strait in the world. Back during the time of the Iraq War and everything, and when we were tussling with Iran, the Strait of Hormuz, which separates the North Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf, was probably the most strategic. But these days, with the major power competition between us and China, it's this one right here. This is Malaysia. Here's a little tiny Singapore at the bottom. This is Malaysia. This is Indonesia. And again, they cannot close off this strait. That would be an act of war for them to try to close off that strait. And they wouldn't, there's no reason why they would want to do it anyway. But this is I want to go over these this is a great slide again, because it shows all the major maritime claims. First thing I want to show you is what in just international relations parlance and law of the sea parlance is known as the cow's tongue. And that's China's maritime claim, because it starts here. Actually, it starts up here. It starts up here, comes down here. This red line is China's maritime claim. It's huge. It takes in almost all of the South China Sea. Okay. Problem is, in addition to China trying to curtail international navigation in any of its claimed territorial sea or sovereignty over the sea, is it overlaps with others. This is the Philippines exclusive economic zone. Comes down like this, comes over here, comes down here, okay? Okay, this is Vietnam's. Starts here, comes down here, conflicts with China, comes down here, conflicts with the Philippines, comes down here, conflicts with Malaysia, comes down here, conflicts with Indonesia now too, Malaysia and Indonesia, comes over here, rubs up against Malaysia, and comes over here. That's Vietnam, okay? And then you get Malaysia. Malaysia starts here, comes down here, but it's also here, okay? This white area in here, this is the island of Borneo. This is the Indonesian portion, which actually goes down here. And this is Malaysia's portion of it. So they have a claim here, 200 nautical miles, all the way down to here. Here's little Brunei, right in this little area here. That's the Sultanate of Brunei, which is a recognized nation of the world. So they have to get in on the act too. So they have their 200-mile. Here it is. So these are all the conflicting claims. So the biggest one, and the one that's really causing the contention, is China's. I mean, it's just huge. It's vast, and from time to time, China attempts to exert itself and its claim rights, and it rubs up against others, including the United States, which is and always has been the principal proponent of freedom of navigation and is the largest enforcer of freedom of navigation. Well, China bases its claims inside this vast area here, the cow's tongue, as you can see here. It bases its claims inside that's known as a 9-dash line, because in a lot of charts, instead of appearing as a solid line, they just use dashes to show it. In fact, on most nautical charts, it is shown as a dashed line. It bases its claim on all the waters within that area as being historic, saying that China exercised its sovereignty, its control, its overwhelming presence through centuries during the great dynasties. And that existed up until 1912 at the end of the Opium Wars. And China's claim is we lost our control of this area whenever China was weak. You know, we weren't able to confront the Western colonial powers when they came in and they took territory from us. We weren't strong enough to counter Japan when Japan came in and did the same thing. And putting politics aside, there's a historical basis for China's claim. The problem with China's claim, I think they need better international lawyers, quite frankly. They're making it the wrong way. They're making their claim the wrong way. They're making the claim under the law of the sea, saying that, well, you recognize these historic bays, why don't you recognize our historical waters in the South China Sea? And then, as I'll talk about a little more in a couple of minutes, problem is Law of the Sea Convention, Law of the Sea, has recognized the nature of historic waters only with regard to the bays, never with anything like this. So they're making the claim, they're fashioning their claim incorrectly as far as I'm concerned, but I'll talk about that a little later. But anyway, they make their claim, and from a historical standpoint, there's a lot of recorded evidence to show the basis for their claim, at least. When you look at this area, okay, you look at this whole area of the South China Sea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, even Myanmar over here, formerly Burma, Malaysia, little Singapore. The Chinese influence is horrendous and can't be denied. The peoples of the South China Sea, the Vietnamese, the Laotians, Cambodians, Thais, Burmese, Malaysians, they're a mixture. They're a mixture of Chinese, Indian, and Malay, for the most part. When France colonized this little area in here, they called it Indochina. Indochina because it was a blend of Chinese and Indian. Filipinos are basically Chinese and Malay. There are thriving large, there are large Chinese communities in all of these countries. There's history of trade going on in the South China Sea for centuries, dominated by the Chinese. So that's the basis for their claim, saying that we also dominated the fisheries. And we had fishing bases throughout the South China Sea, in the Paracel Islands and the Spratlys and so on, you know, and we have records to prove it. The problem is, again, law of the sea doesn't recognize any of that stuff, okay? So they're making it in the wrong place. In 2016, a arbitration panel convened under law of the sea, reviewed China's claim at the behest of the Philippines and rejected it on the grounds that there's nothing in the convention that talks about historic waters other than that Article 10, one sentence that I pointed out to you. That's all that's in there. So there's no basis for it under the law of the sea. China rejected the claim, saying that they had opted out, although they're a party to the convention, they had opted out of the arbitration provisions. So they said, we opted out of that. We don't recognize your jurisdiction to even have taken a look at this. And so that's where it stands now. And it made for a great propaganda piece in the West, and particularly the United States, because they could use it to reinforce the narrative that China is a violator of international law. China says, no, we're not, because we weren't even party to these proceedings. They didn't present anything. They didn't have any representatives before the arbitration panel. Okay, but China said, this is our claim. Okay, before we move on from this, there's other claims. The only other claim that has any importance at the moment is the Philippines, and we're going to talk about that because you'll see Scarborough Shoal. Scarborough Shoal lies well within the Cow's Tongue, and it also lies well within the Philippines' claimed exclusive economic zone. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about a little dot down around here inside the Cow Tongue, but about 120 miles off of Palawan, which was an island of the Philippines. And that's where that tussle is going on right now. We'll take a look at that in a minute. But think about what I mentioned concerning islands being able to generate their own maritime zones. What if China, instead of making its claim under the law of the sea, made their claim on the basis of sovereignty? What if they said, for example, these are hundreds of, there are 100 islands, more than 100 islands here, same here. What if they said, no. We own these islands. Now, you can see, who would they be in the paracels? They would be, Vietnam would object if they said, these islands belong to us, or these certain islands. But that sovereignty claim is negotiable. There's not an arbiter in the world to determine a sovereignty claim. Not one. Not the United Nations, not the International Court of Justice. No. Because there's no international sovereign. A sovereignty claim would have to be worked out between the contesting parties. So what if China would simply say, this island's ours, that island's ours, this island's ours, and so on. This island's ours, this island's ours, and this island's ours. Sovereignty, sovereignty, we own it, we own it. And then China would say, okay, now that we own these islands, we're going to draw these maritime zones. We're going to put a territorial sea around each one of these islands. We're going to put a contiguous zone and 200-mile exclusive economic zone around each one of these islands. They would get almost to the same place. They would have law of the sea claims throughout the South China Sea. And if anybody were to object and put that before the arbitration panel, the arbitration panel would say, well, did they draw a 12-mile territorial sea? Yeah. Did they draw a 24-mile contiguous zone? Yeah. Did they draw a 200-mile exclusive economic zone? Yeah. What's the beef? They'd have nothing to go back against China with. Anyway, if China, if you're listening, I'm available for retainer, but okay. But anyway, but think about that. I've been thinking about it. They made their claim, they put forth their claim incorrectly because there's no basis for it under law of the sea. Okay, next slide, if you will. Okay, this brings the island groups into focus. And of course, because of the scale, you can't really see it here, but there are hundreds of islands here, and there are even more down here. The Spratly archipelago is larger than the paracel. But so China could do that, and they would have vast claims, and they would be proper law of the sea claims. Scarborough Shoals off here lies about 105 miles off of Luzon, which is the main island of the Philippines where Manila is. And you can see it lies within the Philippines exclusive economic zone and China's maritime claim, the Cauldron. Okay, and it's an area contest right now, and it could erupt. It could erupt, and that's a thing that we have to watch carefully when it comes to the Philippines and China getting to a tussle, because as I said, we'll see down here is the second Thomas Shoal, because the Philippines is an ally of the United States, and we're bound with the Philippines under a 1951 mutual defense treaty. And you may have seen that mentioned in the press. It has been mentioned in the press in recent times. And I have to wonder, I have a history with the Philippines. I lived in the Philippines. I worked with the Philippines. Strategically, they love to be considered like a little child of the United States. But the United States is the big brother who's going to protect them. And I have to wonder, with regard particularly to the second Thomas Shoals, looking at their behavior, if they're not actually even egging on China a little bit, because they, in hopes that's going to lead to some kind of response by the United States. Because we are tied to them, to a mutual defense treaty. No question, if China were to attack the Philippine Islands, I mean, we'd be involved. We'd have to. But over a little dot, 120 miles off their coast, which is really just shoal water. It's a low tide elevation. You know, we go to China, we go to war with China over Scarborough Shoals. We used to bomb it. When I was out in the Philippines in the late 80s, and I was stationed out there at Cuby Point Naval Air Station, it was a bombing range. It was a U.S. bombing range. We used to have bomb the dickens out of it. And that's what we did. Now that would violate several conservation treaties that came into being since then, but that's what we did. So this brings the island groups into focus. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, in the area, this happens to be in the Spratlys. This is Mischief Reef, and this is what China is doing. When you look at what they're doing, I don't know why they're making their claims under law of the sea, because this is not consistent with a law of the sea claim. Okay, this is so far away from China that there's no basis in law of the sea for China to take basically what was a reef and use landfill and make this, including a large airstrip. There's no basis in law of the sea, and that's what they're doing. They're doing it in multiple places, both in the Spratlys and in the Paracels. Okay, next slide. And these are Chinese troops on Mischief Reef. Okay, again, that's in the Spratlys. Next slide. I put this in here because I wanted to emphasize how important freedom of navigation is to the United States. We have the most vigorous, by far, freedom of navigation program, where we challenge everybody's maritime claims that we think do not comport with the convention, friend or foe alike. Okay, I'll give you an example close to home. Canada recognizes the Bay of Fundy as belonging. The Bay of Fundy lies off of Newfoundland, if you know that is. Recognizes the Bay of Fundy as Canadian waters. We don't. Our freedom of navigation program even involves exercises of going in there. We'll send a couple ships or fly a few aircraft over it periodically and document it with the United Nations, just to show that we are not accepting that claim. We are the most vigorous nation when it comes to freedom of navigation, and that's where the rub is right now. Because anything China might do to curtail freedom of navigation in the South China Sea is going to get a vigorous response from the United States, which is by far the dominant naval power in the South China Sea and all of East Asia, for that matter. Okay, this goes back to the founding of the Republic. The United States established a national navy well before they established a national army. National army was basically made up of militias, and we relied on militias even up through in part of the Civil War. Basically, regiments raised at the state level. But the United States established a vigorous navy from the very beginning. A point of trivia: does anybody know how many naval battles were fought between the Americans and the British during the American Revolution? I didn't either, so don't feel bad if you don't. But if you said 241, you'd be correct. I had no idea. I had no idea. 241 naval battles fought between the Americans and the British. British at that time, the Royal Navy, nobody could touch it. It was by far the most powerful Navy in the world. And the fledgling Americans, went up against it time and time again. Next slide, please. Okay, this again just comes back, and what I wanted to show here, I think, I really wanted to go to the next one because I want to go there. There we go. That's the one. Okay, here's second Thomas Shoal right here. And here's that cow's tongue again. This time it is a dashed line. Okay, there's second Thomas Shoal within China's claimed maritime waters, but it's also in the Philippines exclusive economic zone. So that's where the tussle lies. Okay, next slide. Okay, in 1999, the Philippines took an old rust bucket that they had acquired from the United States after World War II, and they commissioned it, the BRP Sierra Madre, and they beached it on this low tide elevation, on this reef, okay, which lies in the Philippines claimed economic zone. And they have been kind of off and on tussling with China ever since. And lately, it's heated up. Next slide. China has sent its Coast Guard in to basically harass the Filipinos and try to drive them out of there. And you can see these are Chinese well-wishers. That's not a peace sign, that's a victory sign. Well-wishers, Chinese well-wishers, as their Coast Guard units go off to challenge the Philippine rust bucket. Okay, next one. This is not a drawing. This is actually just a poor resolution photograph, but it shows what's actually going on right now. And that is a tussle between the Chinese Coast Guard and the Philippine Coast Guard here. This is a rubber boat, and this guy's got an axe. And so far, there's been no shooting. There's been no shooting, but they've been hurling insults back and forth. They've been spraying water back and forth on each other. And this guy actually took an axe and he sunk the boat, put a big gash in it and sunk it. China said, oh, we didn't mean it. That was an accident. But they did it nonetheless. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, again, I just wanted to point that in there. Again, here's second Thomas Shoal, right about here. With China, let's assume that China does push the Philippines off that reef. Would the United States go to war with China over something like that? Again, if they were to attack the Philippines, probably yes. At least there would be a military response of some kind. But what about this? History shows that it's not necessarily likely. And that's the last kind of point I wanted to end with there. Can I have the next slide? Okay, this is the USS Liberty. And during the Arab-Israeli 1967 war, Israeli forces attacked the USS Liberty and they killed 32 crew members and heavily damaged the ship. This was an unarmed Navy intelligence gathering ship in international waters off the Sinai Peninsula. Israel apologized and said, whoops, we didn't mean it. And they paid $36 million in compensation to the United States. The United States did not respond militarily. There was no military response. This shows the murkiness of international relations. The big picture usually prevails. The relationship between the United States and Israel was deemed to be of greater importance than this particular incident, and there was no military response. The next slide, please. Yeah. The next, we're just about done. The next slide here is, this is the USS Liberty a year later. in 1968 in international waters off the coast of Korea. Again, an unarmed Navy intelligence ship. It was attacked by the North Koreans. One crew member was killed. The ship was captured. The crew was imprisoned for over a year. The crew was released, and the North Koreans still have the ship. It's now a museum. Again, the United States did not respond militarily. It shows again, the murkiness of international relations. The big picture prevails over individual incidents. And that could well come into play with regard to Second Thomas Shoal. Next slide, please. Okay. And I leave you with the question, would we go to war over a situation like that? It's really up to these two guys. It's up to these two. And again, I think that it would depend on the overall dynamics of the relationship between the United States and China. Right now, we're locked in the competition with them economically, technology-wise, militarily. We still have a very much an interconnected relationship economically, even though Trump is trying to decouple, as he uses the term. But it's really up to these guys. So we'll have to see. But my guess is not necessarily. The point I want to make is the larger bilateral relationship would prevail. And we find a way to kind of work past an individual incident like that. Okay, next slide. As a proud member of the Naval Service, I'll leave you with this. Okay, all right, that's it. That's all I got. Okay, thank you. Okay, any of you want to stick around? And the other thing I'll mention, for those of you, like I said, I'll stay all day if you want to. It doesn't matter to me. I'm happy to talk about Taiwan. If anybody wants to stay and listen to that, discuss that for a little bit, because the other area at the north end of the South China Sea is the Taiwan Strait. And the Taiwan Strait is another area where it's most likely, if we're going to get into some kind of a contest militarily with China, that's where it's likely to take place.
Yeah, Jerry.
Well, you may need more different kind of therapy after this, Roy. But oh, okay. You're quite welcome. All right,
Yeah,
questions?
Jerry, what is China's end game by making these claims about their line in their territory?
Yeah.
What would they be able to do that they can't do now?
What could they do with that? Well, they're getting a lot of heat. They're getting a lot of heat because of the facilities they're building. Okay, the military facilities. I mean, I just showed you Mr. Freeth, but there are many, many more throughout the Paracels and throughout the Spratlys in particular. So they're continuing to build these things. They're increasing their military presence, and the main thing they're doing is they are building up their naval forces. Right now, the United States is still very much the dominant naval power in the South China Sea. Okay, China's catching up rapidly. It really is, in terms of its capabilities, both in terms of surface ships, submarines, and aircraft, and now drones. So they're catching up rapidly. So what could they do? What we're doing now is we are challenging them on the basis using the law of the sea. We're hammering them. I just looked at material come out of the U.S. Indo-PACOM, which is the United States Indo-European Command, which has jurisdiction over that area, right? And I'm reading this stuff, and they're hammering China using law of the sea. China, you're violating law of the sea. You're violating law of the sea. You're violating law of the sea. And I'm saying, you got more than that, really, to go back with. They won't challenge the sovereignty claim. And that's really what it comes down to. There's nothing in the law of the sea that permits China to build facilities like that on a sandbar or a reef or shoals. No, they're doing it, okay? And they're claiming that, oh, we can do it because these waters are historic. And you're using the law of the sea.
Jerry, you mentioned something very specific and I think very important earlier on that is, I think, the basis for China having drawn that big swath, the tongue of the, okay. And that is that they have these islands, and you had showed a picture of one, and you just referred to it, okay? But in the convention that you were part of, that promulgated the law of the sea, it said naturally occurring. When they build an island, that's not naturally occurring. And so that is a major, in my mind, a major conflict with the law of the sea. Is it not?
It depends on the nature. I want to go back to the maritime features, okay? If it is an island, in other words, there's any part, let's call that an island, what they're doing, just for purpose of discussion. If there's any part of it that is above water all the time and can sustain habitation, human habitation or economic activity, which means, for example, could they go trees on there and harvest them? Is there plant life on there that they could harvest? Can they drill through down there and extract oil or gas? I mean, if any part of it is an island, there's nothing in the law of the sea convention that would stop them from enlarging the island. They could do that. They can do that. We use landfill all the time. We extend our coastline out with landfill. You know, all the major countries do that. There's nothing in the law of the sea to prevent that. If it is a low tide elevation, however, there's no basis for it at all. There's no basis for taking what is essentially a reef and using and importing, you know, tons and tons and tons of sand or dredging and using the dredge material to build up the reef into an island. There's no basis for that at all. That violates the law of the sea. Clearly violates the law of the sea. So it depends on the nature of the feature that they're working with in the first place. But the only point I want to make is that we're not helping ourselves. If we want to confront China's claims, we're not helping ourselves by saying you're violating the law of the sea, you're violating the law of the sea, because they simply don't accept it. And in a broader sense, if I were doing this would be, if I were teaching a college level or graduate level course, this would be 2 or 3 sessions. And we would go much deeper into things. But they're not helping themselves by doing that, by using the law of the sea. Probably nobody picked up on this. I did because I knew what he was talking about. When Roy was given his introduction, he mentioned that I was mentored by a man named Myers McDougall from Yale University. Myers McDougall was and his family were dear friends of Roy and his family growing up and throughout their academic lives. The McDougall School of International Relations at Yale, later became known as the Yale School, is based on value analysis. And it says if you really are in a relationship with anybody, whether it's your wife, your friend, I mean, internationally, it doesn't matter. If you're in a relationship and you're trying to work this relationship and you have a difference in opinions or point of view, to really get to the heart of it, you need to know what's behind that other party's position. You need to know what values underlie that position. And that's what that's what McDougall always emphasized. And so I take that approach when I analyze an international situation. Where is China coming from? What's, you know, it was like Reagan said when he got shot. He said, what was his beef? Okay. What's China's beef? What's China's beef? China's beef is we have this great civilization. It goes back more than 5,000 years. And every time China was weak, somebody took advantage of us. From the time of the earliest Western expeditions into China, every time we were weak, somebody came in and ripped us off. Okay? Taiwan is an example. Okay? The coastal area of China, you know, Canton, Shanghai, okay, were examples. Okay? Somebody came in and ripped us off. The British took Hong Kong from us, forced us after the Opium Wars, which are now, by the way, looked upon almost the same way as the Spanish Inquisition. Actually, utterly shameful. Forced opium, the British forced opium on China for payment for tea. Forced opium on them. What gave rise to the Opium Wars was China saying enough. And they tried to fight back and they weren't successful. Xi Jinping knows this. He knows this. This is his thing. This is his agenda. China was weak and it's never going to happen again. Am I advocating China? Am I up here as an apologist for China? No, I'm not. I'm up here as an analyst of international law and international relations. You got to know what's behind this. And why doesn't China accept a lot of our principles of international law? Because they weren't permitted to participate. Let me go back to the Law of the Sea Convention. Okay, over 10 years of negotiations. They started in the mid-70s, got serious in the late 70s, and built to a crescendo through the 80s, right? Okay, into the early 80s. China, China sent representatives from time to time to these meetings. Anybody listen to them? No. No. You know why? Because the United States wouldn't let them. They were communist. Communists. We don't like communists. No. And China was weak. China was weak in those days. China did not have a say, a meaningful say, although they had representatives at the table. So why don't they accept these rules? Because they said, hey, we weren't allowed to participate in it. We weren't able to give our meaningful input in putting this stuff together. So that's the value analysis, what's behind. Then you can understand where Xi is coming from. We were weak and we will never be weak again.
Two more
Jerry.
questions.
Okay, there's it. Elliot.
I have a question. You kept on stressing how America is very much for freedom of the seas and protecting navigation. Were you surprised when we had an extremely weak response to the Houthis really threatening freedom of the seas and forcing a tremendous disruption on, you know, in the Middle East area? Were you surprised at that kind of a weak response?
One word answer, no. No. And why wasn't I surprised? Because again, because of the work I've done in various areas, I was aware of the larger picture. And the larger picture is the relationship between the Houthis. If Iran was not backing the Houthis, Houthis be gone. Okay, Houthis, I mean, they'd be gone. No question. It's all about Iran. It's all about Iran, taking on Iran. The cost of taking on Iran is just far too great.
One quick final question, I guess. So you've talked about this inherent inability of the United States and China as the two dominant powers there to see one another's, not to see one another's position, but to acknowledge one another's position and to allow the Chinese position to prevail. So what is the way forward? How can you deal with this situation, or should you even deal with it?
Very, very good question. I assume you all heard the question. Yeah, to say at the high levels, I'm going to stick my neck out here. I don't know what to say about this administration. I don't know how knowledgeable the Secretary of Defense is, the Secretary of State, the Vice President. I look at their statements and I cringe. I don't know how knowledgeable they are or who they're listening to. So I would hope, and I would like to believe at the highest levels of government, yes, we know exactly what China's position is and why they're making it. We know that exactly, but we can't handle it. It's the Thucydides trap that Graham Allison was talking on. When I look at the conduct of the United States toward China since 2017, when Trump came in to the White House, his first term, and it's very, very clear. And I'm not blaming Trump, because anti-China sentiment is at its highest in the States, is that, and among the American public, is at its highest level since the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It's pervasive, and it's encouraged by politicians and the media. You know, China evil, Americans good. You know, democracy good, China's communist. Well, anybody who has studied modern China and knows modern China knows that China is barely communist, and communist in name, pretty much name only. It's a capitalist society. It just happens to have a centrally managed economy. It is not capital. It is not communist in the Marx-Leninist sense. Never was. Even during the Cold War, it rejected the Soviet model. Never followed the Soviet model. Xi talks about communism with Chinese characteristics. What he's saying is basically not real communism. It's more the Chinese characteristics. China is a society based on Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism. They're the principles and they're the values that underlie China's society. It's about family. It's about the state. It's about the collective. And that is totally anathema to our tradition. So that really lies at the heart of what all this is about. We have a totally different history from China. Our values come from the Renaissance and the Enlightenment after the Middle Ages. They come from all the way back to the Greeks and their ideas of democracy and the people, the power that individuals have, brought forward to today. China's history, totally different. So you say, okay, why is Taiwan so different? Why is South Korea so different? You look at those countries and you see how heavily influenced they were and are. They're basically Western countries with Asian characteristics, because they have taken on the values of the West, which are so different than the values of the East. And this is what's causing the contention at the heart of the U.S.-China relationship. The Thucydides trap is probably very, very real, very real. You know, we think our way is best, and we're going to fight to preserve it. Okay? Globalization has allowed China to develop basically its economy, essentially its economy, and go from being a very much a developing nation to second largest, having the second largest economy in the country. I mean, they were overtaken country by country by country. All our Western allies, you know, all these great civilizations in Europe, overtaken, economically, militarily. And that's a challenge. It's a real challenge. I don't know how you get past it. The only way to get past it, I think, is we came to a point with the Soviets, you may remember, and it started like with Brezhnev, actually, where we came in and we developed, I think it came out of a conference between, may have been Johnson and Kosygin or something, I forget, it went back like into the late 60s, early 70s. Anyway, they came out of a conference, and then the principle of mutual coexistence came into play, where we were going to learn, we'll never agree, but we're going to learn to get along together, okay? It's probably going to take that kind of approach. You know, I read a lot about China. I subscribe to South China Morning Post, and I read it every day. And it, by the way, it's not a Chinese communist propaganda rag. Most of their contributors actually are names you would recognize, you know, who write for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and Washington Post and so on. Foreign relations, foreign affairs rather. So it's not that kind of a publication. But so there's nothing in China's writings that suggests anywhere that China wants to take over the world. Nothing. China said, why do we want to do that? China, a large portion of the leadership in China is Western educated. Many in the United States. Many have lived here, worked here for years and years and years, and they know our society inside and out. To a much greater extent than we know theirs. Okay? So there's nothing to indicate. You talk to, you know, Chinese people in the Chinese leadership and in academia and in their corporate world and so on, and they say, you can't be Chinese.
Jerry, thank you so much. That was such a great talk.
Okay, you can
Thank
cut it off,
again.
but I want to stay
You
in.
can come up and ask more questions to him if you want to.
Yeah, if anybody wants, they know I can't be Chinese. You can't be Chinese, but they can be Americans, and they